Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Victoria Mattingly, and I'd like to welcome you to the PsyOp Conversation Series live stream podcast, where we talk with leading industrial organizational psychologists. This is episode 39, where we'll be talking about science for a more inclusive workplace. Today, our guest discusses one of the top 10 trending topics in the field of IO psychology, enhancing inclusivity within the workplace and showcasing a dedication to increased accessibility, sense of belonging, and justice. Welcome to the conversation series, Ludmila.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here and look forward to our conversation.
Me as well. Dr. Ludmila Praslova is a graduate organizational psychology professor for the School of Business at Vanguard University of Southern California. She has extensive experience in global diversity, neurodiversity, and creating cultureAD organizations. I love cultureAD and not culture fit. I hope we get to that in our conversation. Her current consulting is focused on creating organizational systems for belonging. She has also provided training and education on neurodiversity inclusion to organizations such as Amazon, Bank of America, IBM, MIT, and Affinity Health. Her most recent research and writing are centered on neurodiversity, especially autism inclusion in the workplace. She's the author of the CANARY Code, a guide to neurodiversity, dignity, intersectional belonging in the workplace. And she's the editor of Evidence-Based Organizational Practices for Diversity, Inclusion, Belonging, and Equity. Her peer-reviewed work was published in Industrial Organizational Psychology, Perspectives on Science and Practice, Educational Assessment, Evaluation and Accountability, and Assessment Update. She regularly writes for Fast Company, Harvard Business Review, Psychology Today, and SHRM. And she serves as the editor of the upcoming special issue of the consulting psychology journal, Practice and Research on Disability Inclusion in the Workplace, from Accommodation to Inclusive Organizational Design. I must also say that the views and opinions expressed in today's conversation are those of the guest and myself and do not necessarily reflect the views of PsyOp. Ludmila, thank you so much for joining us here today.
I'm thrilled to be here and I look forward to our conversation, Victoria.
Yes. And, I'm going to just share my bias up front. I too am I'm curious if you define yourself as a scientist practitioner or a scholar, or like what term you use to define, your current career. But I like to call myself a practitioner scholar because I practice first, but I try to do research. And it sounds like you're really doing so much of that important work that then informs your consulting, but also the work that other practitioners do. So I just want to thank you for that. But enough about that. To start our conversation, we'd love to hear about your journey as an IO psychologist. So how did you get involved in the field and what ignited your interest in workplace diversity and inclusivity?
I actually can't remember not being interested in diversity. I always had culture as one of the things that I was always very interested in. I mean, like since I was 8 or 12 or something very young. So obviously I didn't envision being industrial organizational psychologist because I didn't know what that was. But as far as being interested in culture and humans and how humans interact with their environments, I literally can't remember never being interested in that. And then I got a degree. It was kind of eclectic, human resources management slash psychology, a little bit of everything. And then I just kind of fell into global diversity. I started working part-time when I was 19, specifically with multicultural global organizations. And then when I was 22, I started doing that full-time. And basically, that's what I've been doing. So I started with global diversities on the level of national cultures. And then I kind of migrated through all the different levels, the gender and culture and smaller units than the nation level. And then I arrived to neurodiversity, which is our smaller individual human unit of diversity. But it's always been a major thread of what I was doing.
So, okay, quick question. You mentioned very briefly, like cultural diversity, cultural inclusivity. What did you mean by that? What does that? Is that more of like how we have, the different, is it Hofstede's, different types of, collective versus individualistic, or is it something different?
Well, you can think about it through Hofstede's dimensions, or you can think about it through various other dimensions. But so this is the organization that I've been working with for the first 7 years of my career. Uh, I don't want to give too many specifics, but so imagine a global organization
Hmm.
where, let's say, the board members and funders are from one country and a couple of other ones, but let's say like some of the richer countries. And then all the CEOs and the C-suite are from another country. Let's say it's one of the Eastern European countries. And most employees are from yet another Eastern European country and like a bunch of other Eastern European and Asian countries, and none of them like each other. So that was my first several years of what I was doing. So good luck to me, right? But I didn't know that was supposed to be hard. So I just kind of jumped into it. And what we're able to create within this organization is that regardless of whatever history that people had on the national level, on the level of relationships within the organization, it was really very much culture ad. Everyone kind of at least had basic phrases on many languages. We had super eclectic food with like things that you would never think of pairing together. And so that kind of the national level culture blending with no dominant culture, even though financially and structurally there were dominant cultures, but not in everyday relationships and how at least most people treated each other. So that's what I think about it as global diversity, specifically on the like national level intercultural relations. But then you also have other things like gender, which was a whole other dynamic because we had some people from cultures where gender roles were very specific, and that was a whole other issue. But it was definitely working with multiple levels of diversity, but national level would be predominant in that particular context.
That's super insightful. And I've been doing a lot of thinking myself on like what is global diversity. And I think I'm very much in the workforce space, but to think about it in more of this executive level, running the company together, shared perspectives, that's a very interesting and inclusive way of looking at it. So thank you for that. And then you were also talking about your neurodiversity work and how your career progressed into eventually becoming an expert in that space. Can we take a step back? And I'm so curious to hear your perspective on this as a neurodiversity expert. Can you help break down the different terms for the audience out there? So, for example, there's neurodiversity, there's neurodivergence, there's neurodivergent. What are these different terms, and how are they currently used in the community, and how can we make sure that we're using them properly when we're talking about various communities and individuals?
Well, that's chapter one of my book. But neurodiversity is obviously a broad term that is used in many different ways, but the idea really comes from the late 90s and the autism right movements that grew out of disability rights movement, and people started talking about differences on the psychological level. So it was a zeitgeist in the late 90s, and then the term neurodiversity crystallized in the work of Judy Singer in a more academic format, and Harvey Bloom, who wrote an article in Atlantic. And all of this happened kind of around the same time. But Judy is usually credited because her work was more scientific from the sociological perspective. So she was looking at neurodiversity within humanity. It's kind of like biodiversity within larger life. But structurally, not every type of psychological makeup out there has the same position in society, and some of us kind of getting a short stick of the society. So she took it from the medical conversation and into a social power structure type of conversation that was very novel at the time. So neurodiversity is just a characteristic of humanity. So we all have different ways of thinking, and yes, it came from specifically talking about developmental differences. Originally, autism, very quickly they started talking about all the other developmental differences like learning differences and ADHD, and then people also started talking about it in many other contexts, like anxiety, depression. Where did those fit? So then people actually coined another term, neurominority, to specifically apply to, let's say, autistic, ADHD, dyslexia people, and then the larger term, neurodivergent people. That would be, the broader types that might exist there. Maybe people who had brain trauma, maybe people who had, multiple kind of life experiences that led to PTSD, and maybe there's a layer of other differences. So neurodivergent is an individual level term that's applicable to people who somehow, in some way, do not fit the societally determined definition of what is uh, the neuronormative expectation from the person. So we call the people neurotypical, who kind of fit and are able to abide by those expectations. And then we're talking about neurodivergent people who are, for some reason or other, have trouble fitting into that particular societal box. So it was kind of a long question. There's actually really a lot. It's a pretty complicated area that's evolving as well.
Thank you
So
for that. Thank you for that.
yeah.
Yeah, just learning even how to use the different terms. And what's been interesting in our work with these different populations, because we help organizations build employee resource groups or affinity groups. And, we had one large company that they wanted a disability ERG, which I've actually want to reterm ability-based diversity. And because we all fall on some sort of ability-based spectrum across all those different factors you mentioned, whether it's physical, mental, various, whether it's neurodivergent or, mental illness, and like, what's those delineations? And so talking about whether neurodiversity should fall under that, or if that's its own, group in and of itself. And so it's just fascinating to get this refinement too, because what's interesting is these have been issues, people have been dealing with, neurodivergence for as long as there's been people. But this is the first time I feel in history that we're really trying to put an understanding and a taxonomy around it, definitions around it, words around it, more diagnoses around it. So anyway, I'm getting off track. Let's get back to our conversation. Let's get back to you. So something else.
I'm happy to talk about neurodiversity for, a very long time.
I have a feeling this won't be the first time you and I chat about neurodiversity. So I look forward
Just the
to
topic
this.
of disability versus neurodiversity, like that's a whole other episode.
Yeah, I would love to continue that. But let's put a pin in that. And something else that you mentioned when you were talking about your work was cultureAD organizations. And so can you tell us a little bit more about what exactly is a cultureAD organization, and then how the work you do for helping cultures become just that? Oh, and
Sure.
one more quick point. So sorry. For those of y'all tuning in, hello. I love seeing the comments. Feel free to start plunking questions in there, and we'd love to take some questions from the audience. So if anything Ludmila says sparks a question for you, please drop it in there, and we'll hope to answer. That's the benefit of tuning in live. But yes, cultureAD organizations. Let's hear about them.
Well, in my initial example, you could kind of see the threads of cultural organization. Instead of trying to make everyone conform to one culture, we're practicing many different ways and many different traditions. In a more formal way, we could say that culture-AD approach is the form of valuing diversity in the workplace, where hiring, professional development, leadership development are not focused on what we've been doing for a very long time as culture fit, but rather focused on expanding and complementing existing cultural, personal way of thinking competencies within an organization. So instead of saying, okay, we're hiring for culture fit, we're promoting for culture fit, we're saying, okay, maybe we need a little bit more of collective or more individual or more other kind of different thinking, more visual thinking. So we are starting to think about how we can add those human and cultural competencies, because like culture fit sounds like a good innocent thing, but we know that it's been weaponized and people were using it basically to select out people that for some reason or other didn't match with hiring managers similar to me bias.
Well, and that's exactly what I was about to say. Culture fit hiring results in homogeneity. It results in all the same people. It's an implicit way of biasing and discriminating those who are different. And I think about, I know we got really narrow with talking about neurodiversity, but I feel like something like culture fit and culture-AD, that's more of a universal aspect of inclusivity. I like to talk about inclusion in terms of targeted universalism. So there's things we can do for specific groups and specific circumstances, but there's also best practices that we can adopt across talent management processes. And I feel like this is a really great example, because this is how you get people from different groups, different backgrounds, different perspectives, different experiences. And I love this culture-AD piece. And it reminds me, we just took the Hogans here at my company a couple weeks ago, and we did the team debrief, which was my favorite part of the process of really, and there was a couple visualizations about how much like functioning teams need 5 characteristics. I forget what they are at the moment. And then we saw as a team how much we contributed as a whole to those 5 characteristics. So this is a really quantitative approach to understanding what culture-AD could look like. Is if we're really low on, say, delegation or execution or whatever they were, the next person we bring in, let's hire for execution, let's hire for that. And they're bringing that ad rather than, well, we're very, flexible and empathetic here. And, like we need people to fit in that, but then we're not getting things done. And so it's just like the culture-AD perspective. And I'm curious, do you use measurement in the work you do with organizations to help determine what that culture-AD should be?
Not at this time, because again, we're talking about different levels. So if you talk about Hogan's, it's mostly based on human personality, and what I do is a little bit more on a little bit more multi-level. So it could depend on what organization needs, obviously, and it could be that you are all linear thinkers and you need some non-linear thinkers, and it's very obvious when you're working with this particular organization, and that might be something that's relevant in this particular situation. In international organizations, I very often see that everyone comes from either one country and whoever else can assimilate, and then people who can't assimilate in this particular the national level style of thinking, whether it's, let's say, super individualistic or super collectivistic, and they just kind of don't let people grow if they don't assimilate. So we need to address that particular problem with this organization. And when it comes to neurodiversity, again, we could think about, let's say, emotional diversity, and are all of you walking around with like just specific measured smile and never allowed to cry, or do you have more emotional diversity in your workplace? So I'm a little bit more multi-level and eclectic in that way.
I love it though, and you're bringing in so many different perspectives, and that's something I love about IO psychology. Like we're able to incorporate, different levels, different systems, different, sciences, like methodologies, and so I love your perspective on things. And I wanted to pivot a little bit to the diversity piece. I know we've been talking a lot about inclusion. So workplace diversity and just societal diversity, like it's not even an inevitability. It's here and it's going to continue, growing. We're going to become a lot more different than we are similar as generations, go on. So it's up to organizations though to foster these environments where all this diversity can come in and grow and thrive. And so how can organizations transition from a focus on workforce diversity to implementing proactive strategies for fostering true inclusivity, keeping in mind factors such as culture, accessibility, and equity in their decision-making processes?
Right. So again, that's an illustration of not being a linear thinker because in my case, I think about diversity and inclusion. You really can't have one without another. And it's not necessarily even one comes first, another comes next, but you have to work on both. So, yes, in some ways, diversity is a fact, but is diversity a revolving door? Because that's what very often happens. If you have turnover levels within one group that are much higher than the other group, you might kind of keep hiring, but if you're not keeping, you need to look at your inclusion. So that's one way where diversity and inclusion kind of come together. And when it comes to neurodivergent populations, in some ways, there is diversity, there is masked diversity. Sometimes people don't disclose that they're neurodivergent, but there is not enough diversity because unemployment rates among neurodivergent people are appalling. In some reports, 30 to 40 among all kinds of neurodivergent people, so 30 to 40%, and up to 80 and above percent among specifically autistic college graduates. So we can't say that we have that kind of diversity in the workplace because we actually are actively excluding certain populations on the hiring level. So it really depends again on what particular kind of diversity we're looking at. But we do need to create inclusive organizations, regardless if we're talking about gender, if we're talking about neurodiversity. If we're bringing people in, but our organizations are not welcoming, it's not going to be a good experience. It might actually be kind of like personally destructive experience, and for organization, it might result in turnover. So when I think about diversity, inclusion, equity, it's all one system. So that's kind of a roundabout way to saying it's not a linear thing. It's a multi-dimensional structure, and we need to work on all of the pieces at the same time. One way how I try to simplify it is by saying it's applicable to any portion of our talent development cycle. So, from how you develop your job descriptions to how you advertise, how you hire, how you create organizational culture for inclusion. So that's kind of like a big cycle in the CANARY CODE model. And then there's the key core principles that should inform it on every one of those stages. And if you think about those principles, you should be able to create inclusion on all of them. So let's say participation. People have been saying, well, we need to consider inclusion or we need to consider diversity. I'm saying, like, that's not enough. You're designing for someone else, you don't know what's in their head, you don't ask them. So I think true inclusion is you need to go from considering to involving. You get people to participate in how they design different parts of work environment, and then working for the outcome rather than some kind of personality based evaluation, and flexibility, organizational justice, transparency, valid measurement. So all of those things, there's 6 characteristics of inclusive systems, they should be considered on each stage of the employment cycle, and that should help us create organizations that are more inclusive. I don't know if you've seen my last HBR article. I'm talking about several examples of companies that actually do that. And the article is focused on flexibility, but how organizations apply flexibility across all the different aspects of employment also helps inclusion. So uh, that is the basic idea. We actually have good organizational practices like valid measurement and outcome focus. But when you consistently apply it, it also helps with inclusion. So I hope it makes sense, because I wish I could just project my visual, because it would make a lot more sense.
No, it makes a ton of sense. And what's really interesting, and I feel like doing DEI work, there's lots of dualism, because I come from the perspective, and help what I help my clients do with the measurement piece is really break down what's the difference between diversity and equity and inclusion and belonging and accessibility, so they can understand what those concepts are. But at the same time, it's also true what you're saying. You need to be doing and keeping in mind and holding all those components to be able to see successes in other areas. And I'm actually working on an article right now with Gina Cox, who was one of our previous guests, and about how diversity is the outcome. And we're so diversity focused. You still need to keep, good talent management. I love that point you made too about how good DEI is just good talent management. It's the things that we've been doing as IO psychologists, and trying to get organizations and our HR partners to do this whole time. When we reduce bias from our selection and promotion and hiring and training and professional development systems, we're gonna get diversity as a result. And it's the same with inclusion. So I just love that point. I have a question in the chat from Ashley. What advice do you have to support neurodiverse employees in the workplace?
Oh my goodness! Again, well, I just wrote a book on that, so it's a very broad question, and obviously there are different types of employees, but I think the first thing is just actually to listen to them and ask what each specific individual wants, and just have a habit of trying to say, okay, what do you need to do your job best, to the best of your ability? And actually let them tell you how to support them, because let's say even just within autistic community, you have some people who are extremely sensory avoidant, like me. A little bit of noise, my brain is done for the day. And there are people who are sensory seeking. If they don't have music going on, then they feel lost. So you cannot support us in the same way, except you think we need to ask people what they want, and we need to be flexible enough to give it to them. So that's kind of a very general principle, because uh, just like I said, even just within one label, we have many different characteristics, and then there's all kinds of intersectionalities. So asking people for what they need and just being aware that one size does not fit all is usually the best starting point. But then once you know what specifically works for this person, how you can maybe help them job craft to adjust their responsibilities, or give them the kind of flexibility that they need, whether they need complete independence and nobody ever like interrupting them and looking over their shoulder, or whether they need more structure and someone there to always ask their questions. It really would depend on who the individual is.
Such great advice, and I feel like the take home is we need to get that voice of the individuals or the groups that you're trying to serve. And I feel like a lot of times that mark is missed, and really make sure that you're collecting the data. That's essentially what it is. It's a lot of qualitative data to understand what people need and providing those accommodations rather than just coming in and thinking, okay, people need X, Y, Z. So such a great call out there. But we have just one more question, and then I do want to encourage the audience, if you have any questions, feel free to stick those in the chat. But establishing a workplace culture that embraces both inclusivity and diversity is pivotal and yet challenging, for organizations to do. Neurodiverse individuals tend to be frequently disregarded and often face barriers within the workplace, which you alluded to in this conversation. What are some ways that organizations can actually better accommodate and support neurodiverse employees to promote a more inclusive and productive workplace environment? So you've already partially answered this, around asking and getting that data and hearing those voices. Are there any other empirically based techniques that you found in your work to help accommodate specifically neurodiverse employees?
Well, again, accommodations are very individual based, but you can't just go and have a starting point at Job Accommodations Network, ask Jan, and you will see under specific conditions of what kind of menu they will give you, and then from menu you can work with individuals. But again, if you are practicing the idea of flexibility, that is going to take care of a lot of basic neurodivergent needs, because pre-pandemic, for example, the most common thing that people were asking for is work from home and flexible schedules. So if we start thinking about work from home as something that is common and available to most people, or some kind of hybrid, that takes care of a very significant percentage of needs of neurodivergent people. And then beyond there, you can go with more specific into more specific accommodations. Again, some people need to make sure they take breaks so they don't burn out. Other people need to be reminded they need to take breaks, because like I would go into a writing spree, and I'll go into writing spree for 6 hours because I have an idea and I want to lose it. So some people actually need to be reminded to take their breaks. But just always making it available. So if I want to go to the root of the problem, make disclosure safe and
Yes.
provide psychological safety for people to speak up about what they need to do their jobs best, because very often people feel like they're going to be punished, they're not going to fit in, they're going to be docked on their evaluations if they show any kind of difference. So make it safe enough for people to ask for what they need, and if they want to disclose whether they have ADHD or whether they have PTSD or whether they have anything else, make it so that people are not afraid that they're going to get fired and excluded.
So I have one example about how we're trying to do that. I'm trying to do that at my company. And so I'm CEO, my name's on the company, and I know how I behave is going to influence how my people behave or how they feel like they behave. And so creating that culture of safety that you're talking about, because I've had some health problems recently, and I've been very open about how much and when to disclose with my team to make it safe for them to disclose as well. And then I had a second point about that. But yeah, it's creating that culture of safety and also that idea of disclosure. And that's something I want to do more thinking and writing about here soon, like creating a culture of disclosure and also using data, DEI data and the measurement work I do at the workforce level. It's so sensitive. People are so reluctant. I even say the missing data tells a story in and of itself. Why are people so reluctant to submit and disclose these things about themselves? Why is it viewed as such a threat? And so the disclosure piece is huge. And I think exactly what you said. And we're experts on building cultures of psychological safety. And I feel like that's a huge value add a value add that we can provide to culture ad organizations. But I could talk about inclusion all day. As I said, I hope this is the beginning of a long friendship between you and I hope we have some more talking and writing experiences together soon. Any just closing thoughts about, for those watching out there, if there's one key takeaway that you hope someone gets out of this conversation, or just being more mindful and intentional about neurodiversity inclusion in the workplace, what would you like to leave our audience with today?
I think one size does not fit all. That's one principle. And then I think I need to explain why my book is called The Canary Code, because that also is a principle in itself. When we're talking about canary in the coal mine, that's actually not a myth. It's not a literary device. There were actual canaries in coal mines throughout most of the 20th century, and starting actually earlier than that in UK and all over the world. They were actually used as carbon monoxide detectors because they do react before humans would react. And if you think about some people, neurodivergent people, and otherwise people who don't have enough resources to cope with bad workplace environments, they are canaries in the coal mine. And so the Canary Code idea is creating organizations that work for the most sensitive and for the most marginalized, because that means organizations are going to work for everyone else. So that really is the way I think about organizations. Let's create organizations that work for everyone, and that work for people who are from any category that you can think of that are flexible enough. So, and if you want to know more, just connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm very easy to find.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your wisdom with our audience today. Unfortunately, that's all we have for time. And so, for those listening, thank you for tuning in, especially those who are tuning in live. Ludmila, on behalf of PsyOp, all our listeners, thank you so much for this engaging and enlightening conversation, and just taking the time to speak with us today.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you, Victoria.
Please join us for our next conversation on September 28th at 11:15 Eastern Standard Time across PsyOp's LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube channels. Thank you again for joining us. We look forward to talking to you again soon. And until next time, take care.